Mixing is where a melodic bass track actually comes alive. It's the invisible layer that separates a song that sounds like the professionals from one that comes close but just never quite lands. Almost all of it comes down to a handful of techniques that are used in every professional melodic bass track out there. After a decade of producing melodic bass and putting out official remixes for artists like Seven Lions, Illenium, AU5, and more, these are the same techniques that I find myself coming back to over and over again for my own music. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the 10 tips and tricks that every melodic bass producer should know, and exactly how to set up each one in your own session. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to pinpoint why your track doesn't sound like the reference you're using, why the problem is almost always your mix and almost never your master, how to clean up the muddy low end that's killing your drops, the high-end trick that instantly declutters a busy drop, and the one piece of gear that matters more than any plugin you'll ever buy. All right, guys, so just real quick, before we dive into the actual tips, I'm just going to show you the audio from the song that I made that I'm going to be using to kind of reference and kind of show you guys the examples of mixing. So this is a remix that I made for the song A Better World by Slander and Trivecta. Okay, so mixing tip number 1, reference like an engineer, not like a fan. This first one is all about how you use your reference mixes. And I don't mean just comparing your stuff to a song on Spotify and just kind of seeing how the vibe is compared to theirs. Most producers I've talked to reference the same way. They basically just take a song, download it into their DAW, and just listen to the entire thing against their mix and just try to spot any kind of difference they might notice. The thing is, while you can reference just for an overall vibe, in my opinion, referencing is best as a diagnostic tool, and there's very specific ways that you can really use it to your advantage. So as you can see, this is the reference chain that I have on my master chain. So I have metric AB by a plugin company called Adapter. I've got an EQ8 as a replacement in case you guys don't have that plugin, Ableton Spectrum, Voxengo Span, Utility, EQ8, basically all free plugins except for Adapter Metric AB. And again, I don't think you need this. If you can get it on sale, I think I got it for like 30 bucks. I'd say it's worth it. Full price, 200, maybe not so much. You can always use an EQ8 as a similar type of tool. Using this plugin, I'm listening to specific frequency ranges one at a time, right? So sub, 10 to 60 hertz, bass, 10 to 250, low mid, 250 to 800, mid, 800 to 4,000, and high, 4,000 to 22,000. So I'm comparing my mix against my reference mixes inside of each one of those specific frequency ranges. And then the other thing is I'm also using an EQ. If you haven't done this before, this is really cool. Right click on the width knob, hit mid-side mode, and now you can listen to your mix only in the sides or only in the mono. So the way that I like to use that is I like to reference every specific frequency range I mentioned, you know, low mids, highs, etc. in mono versus stereo in my mix versus my reference mix. So let me show you guys this tip in context and how I might actually use it. So first I'm going to check the low mids in my mix in the sides. So again, right, we're just listening to 250 to 800 hertz. And because I have this utility turned on, we're only listening to the sides of the mix, not the mono, right? So I'm going to listen to mine. And then I'm going to listen to the reference mix. The other thing you can do is if you have an EQ in mid-side mode, because we're listening to the sides, you can click this over into side mode, and then you can also kind of get a visual representation of the frequencies. So as an example, something you can see here, my mix has more bass in the sides, whereas this one has less. You know, there's not like a well-defined bass layer down in that lower frequency of One More Day, whereas in my mix there is. And so that's not always a bad thing, right? With references, you're not necessarily just trying to copy every single detail of that mix versus your mix. The goal here is to try to compare your mix against a professional mix and to try to find any key differences, anything that might be really thin, anything that might be really harsh, any sort of problem that your mix seems to have against that reference mix. That's what we're looking for. So the question you might ask yourself is, okay, so what if I have a problem in my mix compared to the reference mix? What do I do then? So it really depends on the situation and the specific problem. My advice is to always do the most simple technique. Whatever is the easiest solution, whatever's going to sound the best, I think that's always the technique that you should use. So a lot of people, let's say if your low mids in the mix, like I was just showing you guys, right? Like maybe the low mids are kind of quiet, or maybe they're thin, or maybe they're missing frequency in that lower range. A lot of people will think, oh, I got to add another layer because it's missing something. Oftentimes, the solution actually is just using an EQ. Maybe you've just low cut your mid basses too high and you need to back off that frequency range. If you can fix the mixing issue with something as simple as an EQ, say for example, your low mids are too thin, you want more low mids in your mix in the sides of your mix, right? Because that's what the reference mix has. If you can just fix it with an EQ, just go in, check your layers, see if any of them have big low cuts that are too aggressive, back off that low cut, go back, check the reference again, see if it sounds better. Sometimes adding another layer or another synth is the solution, but only if necessary, only if an EQ can't fix the problem. Now, this first tip becomes significantly more difficult if you have a ton of layers that you just don't even need in the first place. And that leads me to tip number 2. Try muting each individual layer. If it doesn't make a noticeable difference in the mix, then the layer is just dead weight. So this next tip is super simple. Basically, you just want to go through the sounds inside of your drop. Like we're mixing the song at this point, right? So by this stage, the whole song should be made. The whole song should be written, arranged, all the layers should basically be there. We're not really creating much at this stage, right? Because we're mixing. So this is a problem that I struggled with for years. I have discovered that most producers, myself included, we're sort of hoarders in a sense. We have a really hard time getting rid of sounds. For whatever reason, we just don't feel like we want to delete anything. And so this next trick can fix that problem very quickly. So basically what you do is go through a bus, go through kind of layer by layer, listen to that bus, turn each individual sound off, and just ask yourself, do you really notice a difference when that sound is gone? If you have to sort of strain your ears and tell yourself like, well, maybe there's a little difference if I really listen, either that track is way too quiet and you need to turn it up, or it's just dead weight and it's just redundant. You probably just don't even need it. So as an example, let's listen to the pad bus in my chorus of this song. So like in that case, right, if you notice, these first two were super obvious when I turned them off. This one, not so much. But when I turn it up 3 dB, all of a sudden it's noticeable, right? So that's a good example there, because I actually do want that layer in my mix, but I think it was just a little bit too quiet before. Right, so as you're listening through, every one of these layers makes a noticeable difference when it's gone, and that's the point. This is a finished mix and master at this point, and so I know that like every sound inside of my song is necessary and it's adding something, so when it gets turned off, it makes a noticeable difference that it's gone. And so I think that's one of the things that can really help your mix sound a lot cleaner. If you have 10 layers and you turn all of them off and it makes like a tiny, tiny little difference, but the song still sounds pretty full and powerful, just leave those layers out of your mix entirely. In general, it's really easy to just waste precious headroom where there's already frequencies in the space that they're taking up. And so that brings me to tip number 3, EQ in context, not in solo. So I'm not saying you should never EQ something when you have it soloed, but the thing is, you don't really know how much of a frequency you can cut away from a given sound unless you're soloing that sound in the context where it's actually going to be used. So take for example, this pad bus again, right? Most of these layers, as you look through them, they have a lot of low cutting going on in the low end, right? I'm taking away low end from pretty much all these layers, right? Especially some of these bigger pads with reverb and stuff on them, all being low cut, even the big pads and stuff, right? So why is that? Well, on their own, this bus might sound a little bit thin, right? On their own, these layers can sound a little thin. But if I solo then my basses with all those other sounds, So I can cut away tons of low end from all those pads and those chords because that low end is already being filled in from those bass layers. So let's look at an even more specific example of 2 layers individually played together. So this is just kind of like a really cool ethereal pad that plays through the intro, right? If I turn off my low cutting, so for one, that's kind of just a big muddy mess. But if I'm questioning, okay, how much of the low end can I really get rid of on this sound before it starts to lose its character? And that's kind of the goal here when you're EQing in context. Basically, if we leave those EQs turned off and then we listen with this bass. Can't even really hear the bass, right? So then again, if I turn on my low cuts and listen with this bass, all of a sudden I can hear the re-space perfectly. Now, as you can see up above here, some of the other layers in this pad bus have more low end than the one that I was just showing you. So then let's take that same pad for example here. How much low end do I need to cut away from this? Well, let's just turn off some of these low cuts so that I can make it a little bit more obvious. So we just have like one big low cut, let's just say, at the beginning. So, okay, we still have more low end in there, right? So if I make this cut, this can sound too thin maybe, right, on its own. But if I solo some of those other layers, all of a sudden, the fact that that individual sound is thin just doesn't really matter because there's a bunch of low frequencies being provided from those other layers. So this is a key to getting a good mix. This is a key to finding space inside of your mix for each individual element. When there's way too much low frequency, mid-range frequency, whatever, overlapping from layer to layer, it just creates chaos in your mix. You can't even hear the individual layers. It just sounds like one big kind of muddy pile of frequency. So the only reason my bass can cut through the mix clean, despite the fact that there's like 10 or 15 synth layers going on in this chorus, is because I have low cut all the low end away from pretty much any sort of pad or chord layer that might have low end that might interact with that bass. So rather than soloing a sound and doing all the EQing like that, try to solo the sound in context with other sounds that might be able to fill in that frequency space that you're trying to cut away. Don't be afraid to make big EQ cuts, especially when there's other layers like a bass filling in that low end. So tip number 4, stop blaming the master. It's probably the mix. So I hear this all the time. Somebody will send me a track, I'll listen to it for feedback, and they'll tell me, yeah, I just think that my master is really off. I'm not really sure what to do about my master. Almost every time somebody sends me a track and they have that same sort of question, it's almost always a huge problem in their mix. It's not really the master chain at all. The master chain is the last thing that your audio touches as it gets exported into a WAV file, but your master chain isn't supposed to be used to fix problems. It's basically there to make everything louder, squish the dynamic range, and make really minor enhancements to an already really great song. So let me show you guys a quick technique here to kind of illustrate this point. So basically what I'm going to do is listen to the mastered version of this song, turn it down by about 6 dB, because that's roughly how much louder a master gets once you actually finish the master chain. And then I'm going to compare it against my pre-master mix, meaning the version of my mix before I've applied the master chain to it. So if we listen to the pre-master version of my drop, versus this. Right, so not only are they basically the exact same volume, but they are nearly identical. Yes, there are a couple of minor differences there. Again, that's kind of what a master chain does. It adds some very minor enhancements, but there's not like gigantic differences from one to the other, right? So if there's like a big problem in your low end, or if the high end is super harsh, or if the vocal's not cutting through the mix, that's something you need to fix in the mix, not in the master. Tip number 5, use span to visually represent whether or not the mix is balanced. So using a free plugin called Vox saying go span. There's a few visual reference checks that I use, and this pretty much works on any professional melodic bass track I've ever listened to. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I'm specifically looking for with span. So if we first listen to my drop with span open, by the way, you want to go up into this corner, go to settings, and change the block size to 4096. That's really important. So if we listen to my song with span, get a screenshot of it, then compare it to the reference, again, with span. So there's a couple of things here that I'm looking at. This screenshot on the right, this is my song, and then screenshot on the left is reference. So a couple of things that you want to look for. First is, if you notice, the volume of the sub is nearly the same as the volume of the 8 to 10 kilohertz stuff up here, right? And here it's going to be the same thing. These ranges are very similar. And the thing you always want to pay attention to here is, like, when you're listening, the volume of something is going to change a lot as you're listening, right? So if I do this reference again, and then if you look, right, the sub is a little bit louder here. The core principle is the same. Basically, the sub and this area around 8 to 10K should be about the same volume. And if you look, it's pretty much the same in both songs. They both have that characteristic. So the other thing you'll notice is that there's almost always a dip from the sub around the bass, and it centers around this 200, 250 mark, right? Same thing over here on the reference. Now, this typically applies mainly to a drop. But again, any reference mix you use, any professional mix is gonna have this dip, and that's something that you generally want to keep an eye out for using span on your drop. This dip is going to look a little different on any song, but generally it's going to be somewhere between 3 and 6 dB. If you look over on this sidebar here, we have minus 27 dB is where the sub is sitting. This dip, the lower part of it, is sitting around minus 33, right? So anywhere in this range, minus 33 to 30 is great. The key is almost every great melodic bass drop is going to have that dip between the sub and the lower mid frequencies. Something else that's important to note with span, when you're in the pre-master phase, meaning you don't have a master chain yet, generally the sub bass is going to be sitting somewhere between minus 36 and 33 on the drop. Right, you can see my sub peaks right around that minus 33 range. So on your drop, that's basically the perfect spot to have it. Same thing with your kick. Your kick and your sub are going to be about the same volume there. And then you can also use an Ableton spectrum if you're using Ableton. Range, instead of auto, set to 0 and minus 40. And then your sub and your kick on your drop, they're going to be sitting around that minus 12 range on here. So that span trick pretty much works every time. If the sub is showing up way too loud on your span, like if it's showing up in that like minus 20 range and your synths don't sound loud enough, you can visually just see that your sub is way too loud and correct it to that appropriate volume of somewhere between minus 36 and minus 33. You know, again, if the 200 hertz range is as loud or louder than your sub, you know you have a problem, and either your sub needs to be turned up or that lower mid-range and that 200 range needs to be turned down. So span is great. It can show you when there's problems. It can show you when there's imbalances, but what it can't show you is what the actual problem is that might be causing it. So tip number 6 is keep your low end clean and consistent and try to reduce reverb as much as possible, especially in the low end. So one of the most obvious ways to tell the difference between a really novice versus a really professional mix is how clean, consistent, and kind of punchy the low end is. So a novice will have low end that's all over the place. It's just as loud outside the drop as it is inside the drop, or maybe it's even louder outside the drop. The low end can feel muddy, like it lacks clarity. It just doesn't sit right in a subwoofer, and it fails the car test horribly. On the other hand, professionals have a low end that just sits at a consistent volume. It gets louder during the drop. It's super clean and punchy, and it translates on every sound system. One of the biggest reasons why this is the case is because people have way too much reverb on way too many elements. What reverb basically does is it creates extra harmonic frequencies and noise on whatever you apply it to. So for example, if you apply it to a Reese bass, or if you apply it to a really big pad that sits in that like 100 to 300 frequency hertz range, it's going to take those low frequencies and add just a bunch of noise and mud, and it's going to create excess rumble below those frequencies. And so all of those things are going to cause problems, and that's going to mask your bass. Kind of like I was showing you guys earlier, right? Like that one pad, if I turned the low cut off, it completely masked the bass and I couldn't even hear it in my mix. So generally my rule of thumb is when you have pads, chords, strings, guitars, you know, anything playing in the lower frequencies, again, like 100 to 400 hertz, somewhere in there, anything with a bunch of reverb on it that sits in that range needs a lot of low cutting to clean it up. So let's take another look at the pad example from earlier, right? This one pad here, right? If I take all the low cutting off of it, this pad has a ton of reverb. right? So you can see all this low end down there. So if I listen to that with my bass bus, if I solo my basses with my pad, so it's a respace and a sub bass. Now, if I turn my EQs back on, take out all the low end. Right, so all of a sudden my bass becomes super clear and it just cuts through the mix. The other thing worth noting is, right, I have my sub here. And if you notice, my respace has the low end cut at 77 Hertz, and same with this other mid bass, low end cut at 90. And so that gives my sub room, so that they're not competing and directly overlapping with the respace and the mid bass. So again, rule of thumb, if something is playing chords, if something has low frequencies below, let's say 300 Hertz, and especially if it has a bunch of reverb and delay and kind of time-based effects like that, you're allowed to do a pretty aggressive low cut on that element to make sure that it's not creating mud in those lower frequencies so that your bass can have more room to breathe. Tip number 7, carve space for your vocal using an EQ, ideally a Pro Q. So the vocal is almost always the single most important element in your entire mix. When I listen to students' tracks and give feedback, when people send me stuff and they want to know what's wrong with the mix, one of the most common things that I notice in almost every mix is that the vocals are really quiet and super buried in the mix. So this tip number 7 is a great way to fix that problem every time. So the best way to create space for a vocal in the mix without causing your mix to sound kind of thin is using a dynamic EQ. So let me show you guys this example. So I have my pad bus here. And then I've got my vocal up above, and then I have this Pro Q attached to my pad bus. And so that Pro Q has the vocal set up as a sidechain. And if you look at my EQ, these are all dynamic EQ cuts that are only triggered when the vocal comes in. We can build a better world, somewhere where the lights stay on. If it takes a miracle, a miracle. So you can kind of see that the frequencies are basically being cut whenever the vocal sings. As soon as there's a breath or a pause, the EQ releases and goes back to normal. So what this does is it creates a bunch of space in your mix. It's cutting away frequencies from all your instruments so that your vocal can sit more up front in the mix and it can sound a lot clearer. So the idea here is, this is not my typical EQ. Typically I would just do maybe 2 or 3 of the really important frequency ranges of the vocal. So you want to do the fundamental frequency. That's usually somewhere between 250 and 300. It kind of depends on the vocal. It depends on if it's the verse or the chorus. Are they belting or are they kind of singing softly? And then you want to do the harmonic ranges, which is 350 up to, let's say, 600 or 700. And then ideally maybe like one mid-range cut somewhere around like 800 to 1000. Sometimes if I find other like really important ranges in the frequency of the vocal, just areas where the vocal is really prominent, then I'll maybe go and make one more cut. But I set this up in a way where this is set up to sidechain mode, right? So you'd basically put a frequency on this curve, you'd set it to dynamic, so it's just dynamically cutting, you'd click auto, you'd click the threshold button, and now you can adjust this threshold. So whenever the vocal hits this frequency range, it's gonna dip this EQ. You can build a better world, a better, somewhere where the lights stay on. If it takes a miracle, the lyrics. If you don't have Pro Q, it's an expensive plugin. You can do this manually, you can do it by hand. This is what I did for years, and trust me when I say it's not a lot of fun, it's very tedious, but it does work. Now, anytime the vocal sings, it's going to be cutting around 2 to 3 decibels worth of frequency away from the most important places where the vocal sits in the frequency range. So the vocal is just going to get tucked right into the mix, and it's just going to be much more upfront. So let me just show you guys kind of before and after. So I have a few of these Pro Qs. I basically put them on any bus that has instruments where the vocal might interact with. So I have one on the piano bus, turn that off, have one on the pad bus, turn that off. I think that's the only thing in this area here. And I've got one on the pluck bus as well. All right, so we'll listen to those 3 buses with and without the EQ. We'll listen to it with the vocal. So now we'll turn those EQs back on. So it can seem subtle, but this is really kind of the make or break difference between vocals that really cut through the mix and stand out versus vocals that just really feel buried, like they're just always competing for room in the mix. The thing to always keep in mind with this, it's very easy to overdo. You only need about 2 to maybe 3 decibels worth of EQ cutting on that Pro Q in order to make enough room for the vocal. If that's not doing it, the vocal is probably just a little bit too quiet in the mix still and just needs to be turned up a little bit. All right, guys, quick thing before we get into the last 3 tips. I put all 10 of these tricks into a free PDF that you guys can download. The link's in the description below. This will allow you to actually reference these tricks as you're working on the session, so you don't have to keep scrubbing back and forth between this video. Go download it, totally free. Now back to the video. Tip number 8, high cut filter almost every single layer in your drop. So this is a really common problem that I hear in people's mixes. They'll have a huge drop, 3-4 saw layers, a bunch of lead layers, several mid basses, atmospheres, right? And then there's high end frequency coming from every single one of those layers. The result, more often than not, is that the whole drop honestly just sounds like a bunch of noise. It's really hard to even hear the melodies. It's really hard to even hear the low end. The thing about that is, like, individually, each one of those sounds is fine, right? But again, if you're listening in context with everything, all of that high frequency being stacked up across all those different layers, it just becomes super harsh and it just makes the mix really hard to listen to. So the fix to that problem is actually super simple. Basically, you just want to pick like one main layer on your drop to have all the high end. So if I show you guys every layer on my drop, you'll notice that everything has a high cut on it. In this case, I actually boosted the piano, but as you can see, there's not really much high end above 10K anyways. And same thing here. I actually left a little bit of high end in there because I wanted that texture and that little bit of characteristic. But if we then look at the mid basses and the leads, same thing here. High cut, high cut, high cut, high cut, high cut, right? So like almost everything has a high cut on it, Same thing here, mid basses, high cut, mid basses, high cut. So you get the idea. What I do instead is I have this white noise layer playing above that 10K range. So let's listen to just the synths. So leads, stack, and then mid basses. So as you can kind of hear, without that white noise, there's not really much happening up in that 10K range. There is also going to be some percussion that's going to add high end up there. And again, if we use that trick from earlier where we solo the high end, if I take away my drums and I take away my noise, right, so that's kind of where all the high end is coming from. It's coming from that white noise layer, and it's coming from some of the splashier percussion samples in my drop, like the hats and the crashes and that kind of stuff. Okay, so tip number 9. It is perfectly fine for your sub bass and your mid basses to overlap. So this is another common problem that I hear in a lot of producers' mixes, and it is especially important if you want a powerful drop. So this is what I see a lot. They'll take their mid basses and they'll basically low cut it all the way up to like 120, 140. And then they'll take their sub and they'll high cut it all the way down to like 80 or 100 hertz. And the problem is you're kind of then left with this dead zone from like 70 to 120 hertz. And that's like one of the most important frequency ranges in your entire drop. Like that's where all the power and the actual sense that there is bass comes from. So let me show you guys what this sounds like, this drop. Basically, if I high cut my sub all the way down to 70, and then if I take my mid basses and I low cut them up to like 140. And let's take those cuts off. And here it is. Right, so the difference is really night and day, especially again, if we use our metric AB, if we just listen to, let's just say the bass, right? So 10 hertz up to 250 hertz. Let's again, make those changes, cut it at 70 on the sub, cut it at like 140 on the mid basses. Right, so the mix just kind of becomes really brittle, kind of becomes hollow. You're missing that warmth and that power that you can only get from that frequency range between 70 and 120. So the point I want to make here is it is okay if your sub overlaps a little bit with your mid bass. As you can see, my sub has frequencies all the way up to about 400 hertz. And my mid basses have frequencies all the way down to about 70. To me, that's perfectly fine because that frequency range is one of the most important frequency ranges in your drop. It is what gives it that power and that warmth. If you have very little frequency in that range, your drop is just going to lack power and it's just going to sound hollow. So every single tip that I've showed you guys so far really depends on one thing. In order to fix what's happening in your mix, you have to actually be able to hear what's happening in your mix. If your monitoring is lying to you, it doesn't matter how good your technique is because you're making decisions based on bad information. This brings me to the next and final tip that I wish somebody had told me 10 years ago. Tip number 10, headphones matter more than any plugin you'll ever buy. You've probably heard a lot of people say, oh, gear doesn't matter, just trust your ears, etc., etc. I believed that for years, and I was completely wrong. For almost a decade, I was using Audio-Technica M50X. They're decent studio headphones, you know, I released tons of music using those headphones. The thing is, they're more for tracking. Just like many other studio headphones, they're not necessarily made for mixing, and they're $100, right? So you basically get what you pay for. When I finally switched over to my Focal Clear headphones, I was shocked at the amount of information in my mix that I could hear, things that I was missing, things that I didn't even know were there before. All of the mix problems that I couldn't even hear on my Audio-Technica headphones became blaringly obvious the moment that I put these headphones on for the first time. For years, I thought I had a skill issue with mixing. I just thought that my ears weren't trained properly, but honestly, I just couldn't even hear the problems that label A&Rs and people that were giving me mix feedback could hear. It was 100% because of the headphones I was using. So these Focal Clear headphones, they're about $800 if you get them from headphones.com. You'd get last year's model on mega sale. They're still brand new. If that's out of your price range, then I would recommend that you start with the Bayer Dynamic DT990. They're about $180, and they're a great starting point as far as a decent mixing headphone. Now, another topic I want to bring up, because we're already talking about headphones, is speakers versus headphones. I thought about this and I wondered about this for years. Should I buy nicer speakers? Is it worth investing the money? The answer is, honestly, it depends. So you could spend $3,000 on a pair of Genelec or Barefoot monitors. The thing is, if you're listening to those speakers in a room that's completely acoustically untreated, you're just listening in a big open space or maybe kind of a boxy square room like I'm in, those monitors are basically worthless as far as playback and sound quality. The only time where you want to do really critical EQ and mixing stuff on speakers is if you're in a properly acoustically treated room like I am. All these panels around you, all of these are placed very meticulously to cut certain frequency ranges so that the acoustics in this room are as flat as they can be. Without these acoustic panels, if I were to listen to my monitors inside of this room, I would just get a giant reverby mess. So when it comes down to it, if you're going to be mixing and doing really critical listening like EQing, doing that on even decent headphones is going to be infinitely better than doing it on speakers that aren't properly placed in your room, especially when it's in a room that's not acoustically treated at all. So if you're ever curious about headphones versus speakers, I use speakers all the time for creating, for writing, for doing like the fun part of producing, and I do a lot of my mixing on my headphones. But when it really comes down to making those very specific cuts in your EQ, these tiny little mixing decisions, I would always recommend investing in a decent pair of headphones over a really expensive or even a decent pair of monitors. So that's the video. Those are my 10 tips. Try them in your next session and I guarantee you'll notice a difference very quickly. So if you want to understand how these mixing techniques are applied to an artist like Illenium, let's say, check out the video that popped up on this screen. I remade the drop from Illenium's song named Fractures. I basically remade that drop layer by layer and I go really in depth into each layer, what I'm doing to it, how I'm EQing it, what it's doing in the mix, and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to check that video out, just click on the link that just popped up at the end of this one. I'll see you guys there.